Have you ever been so consumed with a problem that that thing or that problem is the only thing that you could think about? If so, you're going to understand how I felt a few years back. So back in 2010, I went to Haiti on a fact-finding mission after their 7.0 earthquake had hit and had devastated everything. Whole neighborhoods were completely leveled and the loss of life was just astronomical. And while we were there, we went to the island of Laganave, which sits in the center of the jaws of Haiti. And part of our responsibility was to drive around that island and basically document what we saw. And after witnessing the poverty and the malnutrition of the kids and the hopelessness that was just felt by so many, it was really tough. In one little village that we stopped at, we looked at their well, and what we realized was the water in the well actually rose and fell with the tides. When we tasted the water, it was salty. So you can just imagine the hopelessness that permeated every part of their society. But it was on that trip, as we were driving around the island, that we picked up a couple local Haitians because they needed a ride, and they said they were just going to the next town. Well, we had brought a certain amount of water and food with us, so of course it's really hot out and the roads are terrible and the truck is slow and the drive took a lot longer than we thought. And we started sharing our water with them. I remember thinking at one point on that drive that my buddy and I were not going to have enough water to get back because we had just shared it all with everybody else. And what it did was it exposed a fear inside me that we weren't going to have enough water to get through the rest of our trip. But the reason that I was there was to document all the carnage and the human suffering that was happening. But yet all I was thinking about was my lack of water. And you can see how pathetic that was. My name is JD.goding, and this is Understanding the Bible. And the reason that I started this channel was to take small amounts of text and simply mine the gold out of it. Why? Because I want to make the complex understandable. I remember what it was like when I first started reading the Bible, and to have someone just come beside you and just give you a couple nuggets of information really helps. And the reason I do that is so that your relationship with Jesus would only grow deeper. And if you wouldn't mind smashing that like and subscribe button, I'd really appreciate it. It just helps get the message out there. So there's been a few things that Jesus and the boys have been through over the last few days as we come upon these next verses. The first thing is that Jesus has just taught 4,000 Gentile people in a foreign land. He did a mass feeding miracle along with many other miracles that went along with it. But he taught these people for 3 straight days and nobody wanted to leave. But the second thing that happened was as soon as Jesus traveled by boat across the Sea of Galilee, basically to his hometown, he was met by the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were the religious elite of the day. And what they did was they argued with him in a questioning format, trying to get something on him so that they could accuse him of something. And of course, it doesn't work with Jesus. But what happened was Jesus got back in the boat and left. Jesus literally walked away from these guys. So this is where the story starts for us. The disciples have seen Jesus do a mass miracle feeding, plus however many miracles Jesus did on the other side, and then he watches him best the Pharisees in a verbal spat, and now they're back on the boat going somewhere new. And what you're going to see in the story is the disciples are completely clueless to what Jesus is going to be warning them about. It says the disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. Right up to this point, their predicament seems to be understandable. I mean, they're traveling all the time. They're traveling on foot. They're traveling on boat. It's 13 guys. There was probably somebody that was in charge of the food, and it seems like that person had just dropped the ball because between 13 men, there was only one loaf of bread. But this is where the lesson for the disciples, and I would argue us as well, comes into play. When we become physically hungry or when we start to worry, it can become very easy to miss what God is saying. Let me show you. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. The two phrases that Jesus uses here is be careful and watch out, which means whatever is going to be said next, they need to be paying very close attention because it's obviously really important. What would be expected of the disciples is whatever they were talking about, thinking about, or doing to stop, turn their attention to Jesus and just simply listen because Jesus is trying to communicate something that is really important. Now, what they're supposed to watch out for is the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. Since many of us, including me, get our bread from the store, the yeast thing could be kind of confusing, so let me explain it for you. When someone is baking bread, they put yeast into the dough, and the yeast makes the dough rise. It's a very small ingredient, but it affects the whole batch of dough. What Jesus is saying is the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod is not going to be easily seen, but it is evil. You see, the Pharisees were concerned about their position, their greed, and their status in life, while Herod was more concerned about materialism and his political ambition. Jesus is warning the disciples that both these groups, the people with Herod and then the Pharisees, They are only concerned with their greed, lust, power, and control, and you have to be aware of these things. And the reason Jesus is warning them is because they are going to be coming into contact with both of these groups, and they're going to have to know how to act, meaning that they're going to have to stand on the truth that Jesus was teaching them in order to overcome the evil that was coming their way. This would have been one of those moments where they should have put everything down and started asking Jesus more questions about the evil that they would be facing. But instead, we get this. They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." You see, this is the problem that they're facing. They're worried about one piece of bread while Jesus is talking about two very formidable enemies of the gospel that they would be facing very soon. And on top of that pile of stupid, they're on the boat with Jesus. Remember, he was the one that literally spoke to the sea and the wind and it calmed down. He's the one that's raised the dead. He's the one that's done not one but two huge food miracles in front of them. He's healed lepers, he's healed blindness, he's healed deafness. He's done all these miracles in front of them, and this is what they're worried about. You see, their problem is they refuse to believe who's actually in the boat with them, and Jesus is going to take them to task for this. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Are your hearts hard? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear?" Now, there are times where the disciples' lack of faith seems to go unnoticed by Jesus, or at least Jesus just doesn't recognize it. But right here in this moment, Jesus is going to put the boots to these guys. He hits them with round after round of question that would have made them sink lower and lower into the boat. And you can just imagine Jesus speaking to them in the boat, and they have no place to go. It's not like they could stomp around and run away. They're stuck in the boat having to take this tongue lashing from God himself. It's like Jesus is saying, "Really? You're arguing about bread? Do you not understand?" Think about the conversation that I just had as we pushed out to sea with the Pharisees. What I'm telling you, boys, is real, and you better straighten up, because your mission is going to get intense really quick, and bread is going to be the least of your worries. Then he takes another dig at him, and he says, "Are your hearts hard?" Think about that. If they have a hard heart, there's no way they can go out and do the ministry that they've been called to, because their work would have been dealing with people problems and dealing with false teaching and dealing with the different corruptions that would have tried to come into the church. But yet, if their hearts are hard, there's no way they would be able to stand against that. Finally, he says, "Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear?" Now, this was a quote right out of the book of Jeremiah, and this was a complete slam to them. In Jeremiah 5:21, he says, "Hear this, O foolish and senseless people, who have eyes but see not, and have ears but hear not." This statement is so obvious, and it would have been so embarrassing, especially sitting on a boat with God and nowhere to go, because Jesus is likening their attitudes to the sin of ancient Israel. This would have been a dress down of the highest order, and I cannot imagine how bad these guys would have felt in this moment. But is Jesus done? No, he continues to smash the point home. "And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" Now, if the disciples truly understood what Jesus is saying, this is where their minds would have just completely exploded. Jesus did a mass feeding where he fed 5,000 men, probably 20,000 people total, and they picked up 12 basketfuls. But the key was, it was in a Jewish area. Now, the thing that you need to understand is numbers mean things, okay? So, like, if I said the number 13 to you, what would you say? Well, you'd say it's probably an unlucky number, Friday the 13th. All of that's spooky and nonsense, but yet that number still means something. To a Jewish person, the number 12 always stands for the people of God. So he does this miracle for the people of God in the Jewish area, but then he does the same kind of miracle in another area. And the second example is he picks up 7 baskets after feeding 4,000. And the significance of the 7 baskets is he does this miracle in a Gentile area. Now, what does that mean? When Joshua took the land in the book of Joshua, he had to conquer 7 nations of Canaan. So Jesus is doing a miracle in the Gentile land exactly the same as he did in the Jewish land, which means he's saying his message of the gospel is for everybody. So it doesn't matter who your daddy is. It doesn't matter what tribe you come from. It doesn't matter what country you come from. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. What matters is, do you have faith in Jesus Christ? And this is why Jesus is so intense on the disciples, because they need to understand that the gospel is for everybody. And Jesus' message to them is you need to stay vigilant against the problems that are going to come against you from both the Pharisees and the Herodians. They're going to try to do a lot of evil, but you need to stand on the truth. In other words, he's saying, boys, pay attention and take notes. But what are they doing? They're just simply worried about a single loaf of bread. In other words, they're clueless to what Jesus is trying to get across. Now, they were worried about the bread just like I was worried about the water in Haiti. And yeah, I went thirsty for a little while, but guess what? I got through it. Sometimes we have to look past our own discomfort and pain just to see what Jesus is doing right in front of us. And this can be difficult, but there's a reason why Jesus is going to say this next thing. In Matthew 16:24 and 25, it says, "Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." So here's my encouragement to you. If you haven't done this, just ask Jesus, what do you want me to do? And whatever he tells you, go do that with every ounce of effort that you have. I can promise you that there's going to be obstacles and there's going to be problems. But as you do that, it's the Lord's job to help you overcome those problems and obstacles so that his glory can be seen by so many more people. Now, I'll admit that in this story, the disciples were clueless. But what you read about the disciples after Jesus' ascension, and after they were filled with the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, they were completely unstoppable. Why? Because they had learned what Jesus had told them, and they were willing to spend the rest of their life going after what Jesus had told them to do. Now, if some of this seems like, man, I've never heard this before, and JD, you seem a little crazy, here's what I want you to do. Grab a Bible, turn to the second book in the New Testament, which is the Gospel of Mark. It's only 16 chapters. Read that. It'll only take you an hour. And you are going to get so much more clarity as you read the entire story of Jesus. And I promise you this, while you're doing it, Jesus is going to be talking to you. Thanks, and I hope this helps.